Every year, on the 17th of March, many parts of our world cast off their own cultures and beliefs and embrace the patron saint of Ireland, St. Patrick. But as patrons file into the Temple Bar in Dublin, the Crown in Belfast, and many other pubs and watering holes around the world to take part in the delightful, cheery, raucous revelries that come with celebrating St. Patrick's Day, they turn a blind eye to everything else. The island of Ireland is steeped in history, and stories circulate of the things that haunt it. Those spirits that roam the highlands and stalk the moors, the terrifying legends of things that come out at night to prey on those unsuspecting. Today's episode is meant to pay respect to Ireland and the mysterious stories that come from its shores. I'm your host, Nick, and I want to welcome you back for a new, special chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast just for St. Patrick's Day, an episode encompassing some of the dark legends of Ireland. The first Irish legend in today's episode is one known more widely for its expression than what it actually is. On more than one occasion, you've probably heard the phrase, screaming like a banshee. The banshee isn't just something that runs around screaming, but is actually much deeper than that. Often, many are unsure what the entity actually is. It was never a person, in the sense that it's never existed as a human on our plane. But it can't be a ghost, so it must be some wraith or other spirit. Although the jury is still out, the closest thing that might help us to understand is that it simply is a spirit or some other entity. To get a sense of how we arrive at that conclusion, we have to examine Irish traditional history. As tradition holds, Ireland was once ruled over by its gods, the Tuatha De Danann, or the people of Danu. These deities were neither inherently good nor evil, had multiple names, and were highly skilled in the art of magic. When they arrived in Ireland, they brought with them 4 magical treasures: Daga's Cauldron, the Spear of Lugh, the Lia Fáil, and the Clive Solish, one for each island city from which they ruled. For a time, the Tuatha De Danann ruled over all of Ireland until it was invaded by the coming of the Milesians. The Milesians were the final wave of settlers in Ireland, and the ones credited with fostering and ushering in Celtic culture. The gods were defeated by the Milesians and driven underground, each settling in a mound they chose and became the Eishade, or the people of the hills. From the work Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, written by poet W.B. Yeats in 1888, the pagan gods of Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann, robbed of worship and offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into the fairies. It was from the coming of the Milesians that we first learn of the Banshees. For reference, the Milesian families are those whose last names start with either O or Mac, like O'Sullivan, O'Flaherty, or McCarthy. The Banshee is often known in Gaelic as Benshade or Banshade, translated as Fairy Woman of the Mound. The best example and story of a Banshee is given by Anne, the Lady of Fanshawe, which I'll reserve for the end of this tale. It's through Jane Francesca Agnes, Lady Wilde, that we get our first look at the embodiment and description of a banshee. The size of a banshee is another physical feature that differs between regional accounts. Though some accounts of her standing unnaturally tall are recorded, The majority of tales that describe her height state that the Banshee's stature is short, rising anywhere between 1 and 4 feet. Her exceptional shortness often goes alongside the description of her as an old woman, though it may be intended to emphasize her state as a fairy creature. Sometimes the Banshee assumes the form of some sweet-singing virgin of the family who died young and has been given the mission by the invisible powers to become the harbinger of coming doom to her mortal kindred. Or she may be seen at night as a shrouded woman crouched beneath the trees, lamenting with a veiled face or flying past in the moonlight, crying bitterly, and the cry of this spirit is mournful beyond all other sounds on earth, and betokens certain death to some member of the family whenever it is heard in the silence of the night. The first stories of the Banshee come from the 8th century and are believed to derive from Irish women who would sing songs of great sorrow to mark death of someone close to them. For this, they were given the name Bean Ciont, or keening women. Though they were paid in alcohol, which might not seem so bad to some, this was not a vocation that one entered into of their own volition, but a fate they indirectly chose. The keening women were those who were sinners. Their punishment was to sing these laments and eventually be. The Banshee, as mentioned, sings a lament, sung by it to family members when one of their own was about to pass, a harbinger of death. It was oft taken as the first sign that death would befall the family. If more than one Banshee appears at a time, this is meant to signal the coming of death for someone highly religious or of great importance. It should be noted that Banshees, or the mere presence of them, are not the cause of death, but merely a signal that it is coming. Often, the song, albeit sad and woeful, is said to be full of concern and love for the family that the Banshee serves. It is often heard a few days before the passing, and, more often than not, is heard by the person for which it is intended. These are often referred to as good Banshees, often appearing as beautiful, enchanting women. The alternative, the angry, horrifying, evil Banshees, are those who existed in life as they do in death. They were full of hate, directed at their family, and returned to them as frightening, distorted apparitions. These Banshees do not sing. They are the type often selected by Hollywood to represent what a Banshee is. They screech and howl, emitting ear-piercing noise that is meant to scare. Even different, their racket is meant to celebrate the coming death of a family member as opposed to the love and concern of the previous. It's through author D.R. McAnally Jr.'s book, Irish Wonders, from 1888 that we really get an understanding of the duality between good and evil Banshees. The Banshee is really a disembodied soul, that of one who, in life, was strongly attached to the family, or who had good reason to hate all of its members. The Banshee is one of the spirits who look with interested eyes on earthly doings and deeply attached to the old families, or, on the contrary, regard all of their family members with a hatred beyond that known to mortals, lingers about their dwellings to soften or aggravate the sorrow of the approaching death. In Elliot O'Donnell's book, The Banshee, from 1920, we're given a look into the appearance and the spirit of the Banshee, how it changes depending on its nature. Some Banshees represent very beautiful women with long, luxuriant tresses, either of raven black or burnished copper, or brilliant gold, and whose star-like yes, full of tender pity, are either dark and tearful or the most exquisite blue or gray. Some, again, are haggish, wild, disheveled-looking creatures whose appearance suggests the utmost squalor, foulness, and despair, whilst a few, fortunately, I think only a few, take the form of something that is wholly diabolical and frightful and terrifying in the extreme. And at last, we come to Anne, Lady Fanshaw's 1649 first-hand account of a banshee, titled Lady Fanshawe and the Woman at the Window. In 1649, Sir Richard Fanshawe and his wife Anne, Lady Fanshawe, found themselves temporarily resident in Cork, Ireland, towards the end of the English Civil War, while awaiting commands from His Majesty in England. In October, however, Cork rose up against the king and those loyal to him, and the Fanshaws made a hasty retreat. As a result, they stayed at many friends' estates as they made their way to Spain on orders from His Majesty. One of the places they stayed for 3 days during this time was at the castle of Lady Honora O'Brien, where Lady Fanshawe had a very strange experience indeed. Around 1 o'clock in the morning of their first night at the castle, Lady Fanshawe was awakened by a voice at the window of her room. Arising, she drew the curtain open and discovered a woman leaning into the casement of the window from outside. She was lit by the moon and was wearing white, with red hair and a ghastly complexion. The woman called out loudly, in a strange tone, "Ahone, ahone, ahone." And then with a sigh, more like wind than breath, the woman vanished, her body looking more like a thick cloud than substance. To put it mildly, Lady Fanshawe had been frightened, and it took much effort on her part to wake her dozing husband, who was surprised to find her in such a state when he finally came to. He was also startled by her account of what had happened, for he had heard that such apparitions were much more usual in that country than in England. They were more surprised still when, around 8 that morning, Lady O'Brien told them she had not slept that night because an O'Brien cousin of hers, whose ancestors had owned the home they were in, had asked her to stay with him in his chamber. This was presumably because he was ill, for he died at 2 o'clock that morning. Lady Honora also expressed her hopes that they had a peaceful night, for she had given them the room they had, because it was the best room in the house. But she had forgotten that the specter of a woman who had become pregnant by a former owner of the home and then been murdered by said owner now appeared in the window of the room when any of the family were dying. Our next legend is that of arguably the greatest goddess in Irish history and folklore, the Phantom Queen, better known as the Goddess of Death, the Morrigan. There is a bit of disambiguation at times, as the Morrigan refers to both a trio of sisters, often known as Bot, Onan, and Maca, and a singular goddess. Though I mention these three, you will often hear other names in reference to this goddess: Morrigana, Morrigu, Meb, Namain, Anaid, Eru, Banba, and Fodla. The Morrigan bears the title of the goddess of war, with each of its sisters controlling an aspect of it. The three were known to be shapeshifters, and could traverse the line between both life and death. Being shapeshifters, they could also combine into a singular animal, that of a crow or raven, and being the goddess of war, the Morrigan would fly over the battlefield and was accepted by combatants as an omen of death, striking fear and terror into the minds of all who saw her. As the first stories of Irish folklore weren't written down until the 5th century, and since most stories were passed down by word of mouth for centuries, many details of the Morrigan story remain shrouded in mystery or lost altogether. Since there was so much, Celtic folklore had to be divided into 4 different cycles: mythological, Ulster, Fenian, and King. And up until the year 697, women fought and were highly regarded warriors. So the legend of the Morrigan being both female and the goddess of war is plausible. The first writing in which she is mentioned dates all the way back to 1150 in the Liber Gabala Erin, or the Book of Invasions, alongside the Tuatha de Danann. The Morrigan is a very deep legend, with the 3 sisters comprising the goddess often meaning certain things. The first sister is Bod, who is the conflict side of the Morrigan and is often associated with great battles and their accompanying death and destruction. She presents herself on the battlefield, often flying over it as a crow or alongside her favored warriors as a grayish-red wolf. She possesses the ability to see into the future, and, in the underworld, was responsible for watching over the cauldron of regeneration. She exists between our world and the spirit realm, acting as a shepherd to bring souls of the deceased to eternal rest. The second sister, Maka, was the sister responsible for nature and nourishment. She held sway over wealth, power, and was often the focus of extreme, epic, and unparalleled warriors. Maka could also help with fertility and cared for lands, but she was not docile. When she grew displeased, she could cover those who earned her displeasure in rains of fire and blood. Interestingly enough, the duality in her purpose could be seen most clearly through battle. After great conflicts and much death, it was tradition that corpses were left on a battlefield until the following day. This was a concept known as the mast or harvest of Maka. The ground after a battle was sacred, and surviving warriors did not dare tread on consecrated ground. This was in order to let the Morrigan collect the souls of the dead in peace. The third sister, Onan, worked in a pseudo-tandem with Bod. As another goddess of battle and conflict, she was responsible for everything in battle not physically part of the fighting, but would be induced mentally by way of panic, havoc, and frenzy. She too could shapeshift, in the event she wished to take part in battle. But beware the cry of Anan, the great prophetess who would hearken that death was coming. Her ear-piercing shriek would often cause those who heard it to be intimidated, panic, and become disoriented, sometimes even going so far as to attack their own friends. It can be seen here that Anan may be the goddess from which the aforementioned legend of the Banshee comes from. The greatest story of the Morrigan comes from her interwoven tale with the great Irish warrior Cuchulainn. The website The Irish Road Trip did a fantastic retelling of this story on their website, which I'll read to you. Should you wish to know more, I'll drop the link to their page in our show notes. The goddess Morrigan first appeared to encounter Cuchulainn while he was defending the province of Ulster from Queen Maeve and her army. The story goes that the Morrigan fell in love with Cuchulainn, and that she tried to seduce him one day before he entered battle. For one reason or another, he said no, despite the goddess's immense beauty. Outraged, the Morrigan used her ability to shapeshift and to transform from a woman into an eel. This allowed her to swim up to Cuchulainn as he made his way through a fjord and trip him. He punched at the eel and managed to hurt it, though just temporarily. It then managed to transform itself into a huge wolf. The wolf ran at a herd of cattle and drove them at Cuchulainn. He managed to grab his famous slingshot in time and used it to fire a stone into the eye of the Morrigan goddess, who was temporarily blinded. The goddess quickly transformed again, this time taking the appearance of a cow. The cow riled up the others in the herd and managed to get them to stampede towards Cuchulainn. However, he managed to dodge the herd of cows and hit the goddess Morrigan with a stone that broke her leg and forced her to accept defeat. Cuchulainn made his way back to his base after winning the battle. Along the way, he met an elderly lady sat on a little stool milking a cow. Now, Cuchulainn was wary from battle, and he wasn't paying enough attention. If he was, he would have noticed that this woman was blind in one eye, and that her leg was recently injured. Not sensing the danger he was in, Cuchulainn stopped to speak with the old woman. Apparently thankful for his company, the old woman offered him a drink of milk. After finishing his drink, he blessed the woman, not realizing that, upon doing so, he cured the Morrigan goddess of all her injuries and restored her to full strength. However, the Morrigan did not attempt to engage Cuchulainn in battle. She had already outsmarted him and tricked him into healing her. The goddess Morrigan and Cuchulainn met once before the great warrior's death. He was en route to another battle when he encountered a woman scrubbing battle armor covered in blood. This was seen as a very bad omen to encounter before entering battle. Cuchulainn passed the woman and continued to confront his enemy. It was during this battle that he was mortally wounded. With his last bit of energy, he used some sturdy twine to tie himself upright to a nearby boulder, all in an attempt to frighten off any other enemies close by. Then, a crow landed on his shoulder, and he is said to have finally drifted off to sleep for good. Our final Irish legend is another inspiration on Bram Stoker's famous character, Dracula. Though the world often associates vampires with Stoker's famous literary creation, there was another who preceded him. The legend is born from the 1870 Book of Legends by author Patrick Weston Joyce, known as The Origin and History of Irish Names and Places. The story from this book that we'll tell you today speaks of the Abartach, which reads as follows. There is a place in the parish of Errigal in Londonderry called Slacktavry, but ought to have been called Lochtaverty, the locked or sepulchral monument of the Abartach or dwarf. This dwarf was a magician and a dreadful tyrant, and after having perpetrated great cruelties on the people, he was at last vanquished and slain by a neighboring chieftain, some say by Finn MacCool. He was buried in a standing posture, but the very next day he appeared in his old haunts, more cruel and vigorous than ever. And the chief slew him a second time, and buried him as before. But again he escaped from the grave and spread terror through the whole country. The chief then consulted a druid, and according to his directions, he slew the dwarf a third time, and buried him in the same place, with his head downwards. This subdued his magical power, so that he could never again appear on earth. The lot raised over the dwarf is still there. You may hear the legend with much detail from the natives of the place, one of whom told it to me. There are alternatives to this legend, and some that do provide more detail. The second states that the dwarf king began to suspect that his wife was being unfaithful to him. In an attempt to catch her in the act one night, he climbed out his window, but misplaced his footing and fell to his death. He was buried upright, a manner that reflected he was a man of status and position. It came as a great surprise to those who buried him when they saw him the next day. The dwarf king Abartach had risen from his grave and appeared on the doorsteps of his subjects, demanding bowls of blood drawn from freshly cut wrists. Out of pure terror, they were forced to consult a neighboring clan's chieftain to help them finish him once and for all. The chieftain, a man named Cawthon, agreed to help and vanquished the undead menace. They buried the body again, but were surprised to find the Name Marb yet again wandering town and demanding blood. the following day. Trying something new, Cathan yet again slew him, and buried him in a grave further away. But again he rose. To put an end to the Abartach, Cathan consults a Christian saint named Owen, vice a druid as mentioned in Joyce's story. The only way to be rid of the problem was to kill it with a sword made from yew wood. Once killed, the Abartach would have to be buried upside down, covered in ashes, branches, and thorns underneath a great stone so that it could never escape. Following the saint's directions, Cathan had slain the Abartach by piercing its heart with the sword made from a yew tree and buried it underneath a large stone, so it would never again torment the earth. Today, the resting place of Abartach can be visited in a location known to locals as the Licht Abartach, or anglified as Slot Abartach. You can go and visit today, the stone that rests underneath the tree where the evil dwarf king is buried, and even though he is long dead, locals to the area still report having bad experiences when they go near it. This brings to close this year's stories from Irish folklore in an episode I wanted to put out especially for St. Patrick's Day 2023. To those who listened prior to taking part in today's festivities, I want to express my thanks to you and give you my best wishes for what's sure to be a wonderful day. I hope you were able to learn something today, or just found happiness in being able to hear a few stories. I'd appreciate it if you could give a thumbs up, like, or hit the review button wherever you're listening from and let me know exactly what you thought of this special episode. And before you go, make sure you subscribe so you can find your way back next week for our newest chapter on Tuesday, where I'll tell you the stories of two believably haunted houses, the LaLaurie Mansion of New Orleans and the Winchester Mystery House of San Jose. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda podcast release every Tuesday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'd like to thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful, joyous St. Patrick's Day. Sláinte and Erin go brach.